Hello dear viewers and channel subscribers. Today is August 11, 2025, and this is a brief overview of the combat operations map. The main changes today are occurring in the South Donetsk direction, Pokovsk direction, Konstantinovka direction, and Civisk direction. There are also changes in the Kupansk direction, minor changes in the Kharkiv direction, and slight changes in the Sunumi direction. We'll go into more detail, moving from south to north. But before we continue, please subscribe to the channel to stay updated on new videos and the latest events and news. Kamyansk is currently under the control of the Russian armed forces. Active combat operations are ongoing in Stepnohursk, with offensive actions continuing in this settlement. In the southern part of Plavny, counteroffensive actions were conducted by the Ukrainian armed forces, AFU, and this area has gradually come under AFU control. However, Russian armed forces personnel have been redeployed here to hold back this counteroffensive. At the moment, minimal reserves are present here, with the main forces redirected towards Stepnohursk and the northern part of Plavny. Offensive actions are now being conducted in the northern part to cut off the AFU from their supply road and fully take control of this settlement. Let's move further along the map. Regarding Mali Shabaki, and Stepov, active offensive actions are ongoing toward Pavlka, with the AFU being gradually pushed back to this settlement. Moving further to Mala Tokmachka, there are no changes on the map so far. Offensive actions continue in the northern part of Mala Tokmachka, but counter-offensive actions by the AFU are taking place in the southern part. As for residential areas, no new information has been received, and active combat may not be occurring there. All forces are currently focused on the northern part of this settlement. Moving further to Mirny and Zahorn, the area north of these settlements is under Russian army control, while AFU personnel north of Mirny continue counter-offensive actions toward this settlement. However, the Russian armed forces are holding back this advance and gradually pushing the AFU further away. Moving on to Malinivka, Vishnev and Stepov, Malinivka is currently under Russian army control, with recent active offensive actions toward Poltavka. Combat operations are now taking place on the outskirts of this settlement. As for Vishnev and Stepov, active offensive actions were conducted toward Poltavka and Olhivske, but no new information has been received on this direction. We continue to monitor it. Moving further to Timirivka, we have updated information on the territories. North of the settlement of Zelina Pole, this pocket is under Russian army control, as is the area south of Dobropillia. The pocket up to Novodorivka is also under Russian control. Most of Timirivka is under the control of the Russian armed forces, but active combat continues in its northern part due to the presence of AFU personnel. Moving north to Maliivka, active combat operations continue in the remaining part of Maliivka, while the area from Maliivka to Podubny is under Russian control. Offensive actions are being conducted toward Sichnev and Oleksandrohrad, with reports indicating active combat has begun in these settlements. South of Shevchenko, the forest belts and fields are under Russian control, with reports of Russian armed forces advancing toward Kamychevaka. Moving north to Zeleny High, Podubny, Yalta, Novokatske and Hrushevsky, Zeleny High is fully under the control of the Russian armed forces, with offensive actions continuing toward Andriivka-Klevtsovo. Offensive actions were also conducted along the supply road to this settlement. Mid-route, the direction shifted, and offensive actions began toward Zeleny High and Podubny to encircle this area. Reports indicate active combat has started on the outskirts of Andriivka-Klevtsovo. The areas north of Novokatska, Yalta and Hrushevsky are under Russian control, with offensive actions continuing northward, pushing the AFU away from these settlements. Moving east to Orikhiv, Dhakna, Novukranka, and Zeleny Kut, the pocket from Orikhiv to Novukranka is gradually coming under Russian control, with offensive actions continuing toward forest belts and fields. However, residual combat persists north of Dhakna and Novukranka due to AFU fortifications and trenches. AFU personnel are gradually being pushed back into the forest belts and fields northward. Moving to Udakne and Kotlino, Kotlino is fully under Russian armed forces control, while Udakne remains under AFU control. The area south of Udakne has come under Russian control, with offensive actions continuing toward the supply road to cut it off and launch attacks from two directions. However, active AFU counteroffensive actions continue in Kotlino, with intense combat in its northern part. We continue to monitor these settlements. Moving to Pokovsk, as you know, the Russian armed forces are currently in the center of Pokovsk, and Novokranka is under their control. Combat operations have shifted toward Chuniashine and Novopavlivka, continuing toward Pokovsk. The forest belts and fields south of Pokovsk are being cleared and gradually coming under Russian control. Reports indicate active offensive actions along the southern streets of Pokovsk and in the western forest belts and fields. Combat is also reported in the northern part of Pokovsk, with fighting across all its streets. In Lysivka, the central part is under Russian control, but the outskirts remain under AFU control, with the AFU attempting counterattacks and trying to enter Dakinske. Moving east, the forest belts and fields west of Mirolyubivka are coming under Russian control, with offensive actions continuing toward Mirnohrad. Mykolaiivka is also under Russian control, with reports of active combat starting in Kazatske and Promin, and offensive actions continuing from Mykolaiivka. Moving north, Novoekonomichne and Mykolaiivka are fully under Russian armed forces control, with offensive actions continuing toward Mirnohrad. Reports indicate an expansion of Russian control toward Rodinsk and Chervony Lyman, with active combat already underway in these settlements. Moving slightly north, the area from Suketske to Mayak and Pankivka is under Russian control. Active combat continues in Suketske, but most of it has come under Russian control. In Zatishok, active combat began a couple of days ago and continues. The settlements of Razino, Fedorivka, Boykivka, Novotoretska, and Mayak are fully under Russian armed forces control. Recent offensive actions were conducted toward Nikhanorivka, where fighting is ongoing. Updated reports indicate that the area from Nikhanorivka and Mayak to Novoshakov has come under Russian control, with active combat starting in Novoshakov and offensive actions toward Dorozhne and Ivanivka. In Pankivka, active combat continues, with AFU personnel still present between Pankivka and Mayak due to fortifications and trenches. Offensive actions are gradually being conducted toward Volodymyrivka. Moving to Poltavka, active combat is ongoing in Rusin Yar, with half of the settlement under Russian control, while the other half remains under AFU control. Poltavka is fully under Russian control, with residual combat ongoing due to remaining AFU personnel being pushed into the forest belts and fields northward. Moving to the Klebon-Beak direction, let's zoom out the map. The territories south of the Klebon-Beak reservoir are gradually being encircled from the direction of Oleksandro-Kalinove and Katerinivka. Katerinivka itself is fully under the control of the Russian armed forces, while active combat operations are ongoing in Klebon-Beak. Fighting is also taking place in Oleksandro-Shultino, with offensive actions continuing toward Pleshchivka and Ivanopilia from the direction of Delivka. Reports indicate that active combat has already begun on the outskirts of these settlements. Moving to the Civisk direction, fighting continues in Perezhne. Vyimka is fully under Russian army control, as are Ivano-Darivka, Novoselivka, and the surrounding areas near Novoselivka. Offensive actions are ongoing toward Civisk from these settlements, and active combat is taking place in Serebryanka, aimed at advancing toward Civisk. The territories north of Serebryanka are under Russian army control. Moving further up the map to Dibrova and Torske, recent AFU counteroffensive actions near Dibrova failed. The Russian armed forces are gradually occupying the lower part of the territory from Dibrova and continuing offensive actions toward Torske, which is fully under Russian control, along with this section of the territory. However, AFU personnel are still present in the northern part of these territories, and active combat continues. This entire area is gradually coming under Russian control, and this section of the territory is now being enclosed, also transitioning to Russian control. Regarding the settlement of Zarekne, yesterday's reports indicated specific points, which have now been confirmed. The Russian armed forces are present at these points, and active combat is ongoing in this settlement. Moving to Zelina Dolina, the area southwest of Zelina Dolina is fully controlled by the Russian armed forces. Today, reports confirmed that the territories north of Shandre Holov have also come under Russian control, with active combat now taking place in this settlement and gradually moving to the outskirts of Seredny. Moving further north, the territories from Redkodub to Novomikhailivka are fully under Russian armed forces control, with active combat ongoing north of Redkodub. Otherwise, no changes have been reported in recent days, and active combat continues. Moving north to the Kupansk direction, active combat continues in Hlushkivka, aimed at Novosinove, as well as in Stepova, Novoselivka. Reports indicate that the territories between these settlements have gradually come under Russian control, with offensive actions continuing toward Pishane and Kurilivka. FPV drone strikes are being conducted on Kurilivka, Kovsharivka and Novosinove, where AFU personnel are present. Moving slightly north, the territories northeast of Petropavlivka are under Russian control, with active combat currently taking place in Petropavlivka and Kucherivka. Information has been confirmed about the control of a previously grey zone, now fully under Russian armed forces control. Active combat continues in Moskovka and Sobolivka, aimed at the supply road, the only supply route for the AFU in Kupiansk. Reports also mention fighting in the northern parts of this settlement, with unconfirmed reports of combat starting in the central part of Kupiansk. Further north, Kondrashivka, Dolhenka and Fihalivka are under focus. Active combat continues in Kondrashivka, aimed at Mala Shapkivka and Velika Shapkivka. Zakidne is under Russian control, with Russian forces gradually advancing toward Doroshivka. Fihalivka is under Russian armed forces control, while Dolhenka remains under AFU control. Near Fihalivka, AFU counteroffensive actions are ongoing, but the Russian armed forces are pushing toward Dolhenka. Otherwise, no significant changes have been reported and active combat continues. Moving to the Kharkiv direction toward Vovchansk, no changes have been reported in Vovchansk itself, where active combat continues. However, east of this settlement toward Tiki, AFU counteroffensive actions are taking place, while the Russian armed forces are holding back this counteroffensive with active combat in Tiki. The territories and forest belts south of Mariino have come under Russian control, with active offensive actions now aimed at Vovchansky Kutori, Zibin, and Boshkov. Moving west, Zelina is currently under AFU control, while Staritsia is under Russian control. The Russian armed forces are pressing on Zelina and continuing their offensive actions. However, near Staritsia, AFU counteroffensive actions are ongoing, which the Russian army is successfully holding back, gradually pushing the AFU toward the forest belts and fields. Moving to Lukyantsy, AFU counteroffensive actions and FPV drone strikes were conducted in the western and southern forest belts and fields around Lukyantsy. However, this settlement is currently under Russian control, and the Russian armed forces continue to hold the offensive. Moving to the Sumy direction toward Hornal, the settlement is under Russian control, but AFU counteroffensive actions are ongoing, successfully repelled by the Russian armed forces. Offensive actions are being conducted in the forest belts and fields north of this settlement. Moving to Yunikivka, the northern part is under Russian control, while the southern part is under AFU control. Today, active combat began in the central part of this settlement, but no significant changes have been reported and active combat continues. We will keep monitoring this settlement. Moving west to Kondrativka and Andriivka, these territories, along with the areas north of Andriivka, have come under AFU control. Counteroffensive actions continue toward Oleksivka, which is currently under Russian control, with fighting now on the outskirts of this settlement. Reports also mention counteroffensive actions from Andriivka, with active combat ongoing. Finally, moving to Tetkino, the territories west of Besilivka have come under AFU control and are being held, but no advances have been reported in recent days. However, south of Tetkino, AFU counteroffensive actions and FPV drone strikes on Tetkino and the Hlushkovo-Tetkino supply road continue, with active combat on the southern outskirts of this settlement. Otherwise, no significant changes have been reported in recent days. We continue to monitor this settlement. That's all for today's news and map updates. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel to stay updated on new videos and the latest events and news.